Hi, Miss Foster reading Chapter 7 of Orbiting Jupiter. We weren't more than 10 minutes out of Eastham before it began to snow, and not just a little. The snow came down with hard gusts, socking the sides of the pickup and blotting out the windshield. The sound of the wind was awful, like it was crying and lost and scared and not sure what to do except to wail. Which is sort of what I thought Joseph would be like right now, out in the middle of it, except he would never in a million years wail. We looked out at the sides of the road, hoping we'd see Joseph trying to hitch. But now it was so dark and the snow so hard and the roads already getting bad, I don't think either of us had much hope. He's probably found a place to stay, said my father. I'm not sure he believed it, but what else could we believe? Unless we believed Jay Perkins was out on his snowmobile with Brian Boss and Nick Porter and they had found Joseph, but neither of us said that. The snow got thicker and thicker, and 45 minutes outside of Eastham, we turned around. We hadn't gotten very far, but we weren't going to get much further in this. Okay, so I was crying on the way back. My father rubbing my shoulder, maybe he was crying too. At home, my mother fussed with a late supper. Pancakes, since they were easy to keep warm. She had already called Mrs. Stroud. Mrs. Stroud had already called the police, who I guess had already called Eastham Middle, as if Joseph might be hiding in the janitor's closet or something. So, of course, Mr. Canton had already come by, so full of himself, my mother said, all about how he knew something like this would happen, and kids who come from Stone Mountain are bound to run off, and it's not our fault, and it's just that's who Joseph Brooke is. I thought, my mother said, I was going to take this skillet to his face. She was holding the skillet high over her shoulder, holding it with both hands when she said this. My mother, I should tell you, is a pacifist. She got arrested 3 times during college for protesting foreign policy in El Salvador. She got arrested 5 times for protesting against nuclear power. So she doesn't like pushy policemen very much, or pushy vice principals, and probably Mr. Canton was in more danger of a flattened face than he understood. We waited for a phone call and listened to the storm and waited for a phone call and listened to the storm. Mugs of hot coffee and hot chocolate. My parents talking about what they should have done, how they should have known, wondering where Joseph had found shelter, wondering if someone had picked him up, if he was okay, if he was lost. My parents never asked about my homework. I wouldn't have done it anyway. Later than usual, I went upstairs. The room was as cold as it had ever been. The wood floor was freezing. But for a while, in the dark, I wrapped my arms about myself and stood by the desk and looked out the window for Jupiter. In the storm, I couldn't see a thing. Joseph wouldn't be able to either. And I wondered if Joseph knew what he wanted or couldn't have. Madeline, Jupiter. I wonder if he knew it couldn't be. Maybe he didn't want to know it couldn't be. So he was out somewhere in the snow heading to Brunswick when it was already too late, which he probably already knew, but he was going to Brunswick anyway. Things go through your mind when you're standing in the cold, in the dark, watching the snow with your feet freezing on the wood floor. They do. The next day, Mrs. Stroud called after morning milking. No sign yet. The police had been alerted between Eastham and Brunswick. State troopers were watching on the highway and even the main back roads. They all had the picture of Joseph when he first went to Stone Mountain, even though it didn't much look like him anymore because my mother would never let him keep his hair that long. Mrs. Stroud said everybody was confident he'd be found soon. My mother said, it's still snowing. He won't be out on the roads. My father said, maybe he'll find someone to help. And I said, it's Joseph. He'll know they're looking for him, and he's not going to ask someone for help. They were quiet a long while. We heard the school bus clanking and huffing to a stop out on the road. I didn't move, and no one said anything. The bus clanked and huffed away. We waited. No phone call all morning, or in the afternoon, or at night. When the snow finally stopped and Jupiter came out, bright, bright, bright. The next morning, Mrs. Stroud called again. No sign yet. The police were taking care of things. They would find him soon. That's what she told us yesterday, said my mother, still holding the phone. Tell her we're wondering if we should go down to Brunswick ourselves, said my father. We think we should go down to Brunswick ourselves, said my mother into the phone. Mrs. Stroud did not think we should go to Brunswick. She was concerned that we were getting too involved and had lost a little bit of perspective about Joseph Brooke. After he was found, maybe we should reevaluate. Thank you, Mrs. Stroud, my mother said, and she hung up the phone. She looked at the two of us. We're going down to Brunswick, she said. My father looked at her. I already had my coat on. Maybe Joseph had found a ride all the way down to Brunswick, but we couldn't be sure, so my father stopped every place that looked like Joseph might have tried to stay overnight. Gas stations, fast food restaurants, real food restaurants, motels, churches, even bars. The only picture we had of Joseph was of him standing next to Rosie, and it was better of Rosie than of Joseph, but it was all we had, and my mother showed it wherever we stopped. Outside Lewiston, we found our first bit of hope in a little Baptist church set back from the road in a bunch of tall pines. Pastor Greenleaf opened the door to our knocking, but he stood, one hand on his mop. He'd been cleaning the lobby tiles for Sunday, and looked at the picture, said, "Yup," and handed the picture back. "Yup," I said. "Yup," as in, yup, he was here. "When?" said my mother. I can't say exactly when he got here, but I found him yesterday morning on the couch in the teen Sunday school room. Is he still here? I said. Pastor Greenleaf shook his head. We had breakfast. We talked. He was pretty hungry since all he'd eaten was potato chips he'd found in the church kitchen, and they'd been there a lot longer than they should have been. I asked where he was from. He said Portland. I asked him to give me his parents' phone number, and I ended up calling the phone of some real estate agent in Yarmouth. When I came back, he was gone. You call the police? I did. Really? I said. They told us they hadn't heard a thing, said my mother. Well, they heard me, said Pastor Greenleaf. What's the boy's real name? Joseph Brooke. And your name? Jack. Then I'll be praying for Joseph Brooke, and for you too, Jack Brooke. Hurd. My name is Jackson Hurd. Pastor Greenleaf looked at me. The boy isn't your brother? I have his back, I said. We drove through Lewiston and down towards Brunswick. We stopped again and again and again, but no one else had seen anything of Joseph. We ate hamburgers at dinner. They hadn't seen Joseph either. And then we drove into town, parked on Main Street, got out and looked around, walked towards the statue of Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, since it seemed a lucky thing to do, then stood there in the cold wind looking around and wondering what to do next. No one else was on the street. It was that cold. The sky spitting snow. Clouds still granite. Let's split up, I said. My father considered this. Okay, but we're not going to stay out in this cold too long. He looked at his watch. We have to be back by 4:30 for milking. That gives us a couple of hours. He handed me Joseph's picture. You take that side of the street, and we'll take the other. But after just a couple of blocks, I didn't. If I were Joseph, I thought, I wouldn't go into stores. I'd walk around the neighborhood, hope someone came out, ask if they'd heard about a new baby around, something like that. He'd make up a story about why he wanted to know, and someone would tell him because Joseph wanted to see Jupiter so badly. They would be able to see he loved her, and that would be enough. I turned down a block of houses. The wind, of course, was right in my face now. But still, no one was on the street. Clouds racking up. A few cars driving by, probably with their heaters going full blast. The smell of smoke from the wood stoves the families in all of these houses were gathered around. A church bell tolling once, the sound hard as iron in the cold air. Okay, so maybe I was a little angry at Joseph by this time, but I couldn't even feel my toes. Or the ends of my fingers. What chance did he have of walking around Brunswick and finding a house with a baby, and that baby would be Jupiter? I mean, what chance did he really have? And what chance did I have walking around these streets of Brunswick and suddenly running into him? Like, I'd turn a corner and there he'd be, watching the house where Jupiter was sleeping. What chance did either of us really have? I walked around for an hour and a half. I saw 4 other people on the sidewalks, arms crossed, shoulders into the wind. They were too bundled up for me to see their faces, but none of them was Joseph shaped. I saw 2 kids younger than me working on a snowman, except it was so cold the snow wasn't packing, and it looked more like a snow heap with branches sticking out for arms. An ambulance siren passed, a police car right after it. Once a car pulled into a driveway ahead of me, and parents got out and kids. The trunk popped, and they grabbed bags of groceries. The mother looked at me and almost said something, but one of the kids called, and she was gone. By the time I saw the library, I think my face had frosted to ice. Libraries are terrific in a whole lot of ways, but one way is that on a frozen day in a Maine winter, you can go inside. I stood by the lobby for a long time, dripping and thawing. Then I wandered in. Everything was so warm, shelves of books, the wooden tables, the bright carpets, old people reading newspapers and staying warm, few older people fussing at computers that they didn't get and staying warm, a teen read section that didn't have enough M.T. Anderson, but it was warm, a kid section where a whole bunch of mothers and little kids were listening to One Morning in Maine on tape, and they were warm. Some of them mothers held baby. Yep, I thought he might be there too, but he wasn't. I showed the picture to one of the librarians. She didn't recognize him. "What's his name?" she said. "Joseph." She showed it to the other librarian. She didn't recognize him either. "What's he doing in Brunswick? Looking for his daughter?" She held the picture closer. "His daughter? Her name is Jupiter." Then she looked at me. "What did you say?" "Her name is Jupiter." "This is Jupiter's father?" "Remember what I said about your heart forgetting to beat?" "Joseph Brooke," I whispered. "He's just a baby himself," she said. "He's 14. "Like I said." She handed the picture back to me. "You know her. You know where she is?" "I think we'd better make a phone call," she said. "All he wants to do is see her. That's all. He just wants to see his daughter." "And who are you exactly?" "I have his back. Can't you let him see her?" You don't even know where he is." "When I do, can he see her?" She looked at me. "Listen, guy who has Jupiter's father's back. Probably not. It wouldn't be good for him, and I'm not sure it would be good for her. She's 4 months old. They're not going to be together. Joseph Brooke has to understand that. He's in high school. He can't give her what she needs. He's in middle school." "Even worse," she said. "He can love her." The librarian looked at me, and I thought she was going to cry, just like the Reverend Ballou all over again. Maybe she thought I was going to cry. Maybe I was. Yes, he can love her, and he can do that, but he can't love her just for himself. He has to love her for her too, and that means he has to learn to let her live the life that can come to her with a new home. He only wants to see her," I said. "I know. I really do know." "You're her foster mother, aren't you?" She waited. "Tell Joseph that Jupiter is doing fine. Tell him she's growing and happy and ready for a family. Tell him she needs that family. Tell him that he and his father should let her go." I stood there, wondering what Joseph would do if he were standing there instead of me. "That's a lot to put on you," she said, telling him that. I nodded. Actually, I knew that if I told him that, he'd break my nose. "Take care of her," I said, nodding again. Turned to go. What else was there to do? "Guy who has Jupiter's father's back," she said. I turned around. "Tell him she's beautiful. Tell him I promise to take good care of her, and I promise she'll find a family who will love her too. And tell Jupiter about Joseph. Tell her he tried to find her." "I'll tell her." "He tried really hard, okay?" "Okay." "And he loves her. He'll always love her, even if she doesn't know him." "I'll tell her that too." I turned to go again. I had to, because I was really about to bawl. In the Brunswick Public Library, I was about to bawl. And that's when her phone rang. I looked at her. She pulled her phone out of her bag. I listened for a minute. She was looking at me the whole time. Okay. Describe him to me." I listened. "Okay, I know he is Jupiter's father. No, really, he's Jupiter's father. You better make the call. I'll be right home." She put the phone back in the bag. "This isn't some sort of plan, is it?" Plan? You come here where I work and he goes to the house? Did you plan that? Joseph's at your house. My husband said he's been walking back and forth in front of the house since noon. If this is a plan, it's just going to get you both. It's not a plan. We better go. We'd better go. There's no we here. I'm going, and you better go home to wherever home is. I crossed my arms. Oh, right. You're the guy who has his back. Yes, I'm the guy who has his back. She sighed, and then she sighed again. She looked at the other librarian who shrugged, and she sighed again. Okay, I'm going to ignore my instincts here and take you with me, but only if I'll listen to the rules in the car. She laughed and then nodded. Then we better go. Do you mind if I drive? I'm 12, I said. Never would have known, she said, and I followed her out through the library offices and into the cold. She had lots of rules. My seatbelt needed to be buckled even when we stopped. I had to not interfere. I had to not expect to see Jupiter. I really had to not interfere. I had to go find my parents immediately after we found Joseph. I did understand that, really had to not interfere. We drove out from the library parking lot and down to the statue of Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain again. He looked pretty cold. And past Bowdoin College. Then we took a right down a street of houses, and let me tell you, there were a lot of cars, and this was taking forever, and maybe I was squirmy because she said, do you have to go to the bathroom or something? But I just kept looking out the window for Joseph. And then, there he was, standing in front of a smallish brick house in a yard that was probably pretty nice in the summer, but was pretty bare right now, standing with his arms crossed as if he'd wait until the end of the world, which he probably would. We pulled into the driveway. You stay here. Joseph saw me and then saw her getting out, his arms at his sides, watching. She went up to Joseph and stood close to him. She reached out to touch him, but he moved back and away. She let her arm go down and said something. He nodded. She pointed back to the car at me. He shook his head. She sighed. She said something. Joseph shook his head again. Then the police showed up. They got out from their car. Two big guys. They walked up to the librarian and Joseph with that slow, big walk police have. They stood next to Joseph, and he backed up a little so they wouldn't be standing behind him. They talked to the librarian, and she talked to them. She shook her head. She said something to Joseph again. He shook his head. And one of the big policemen put his arms on Joseph. Joseph pulled it away, which the big policeman did not like. He came closer. Joseph took a step back. I couldn't tell what he was going to do and where. So I guess, could the librarian. She held out her hand and said something else. They all three looked at her. She said something else, and then she ran into the house. Joseph watched her. He didn't see the other policeman come around behind him. That's how hard he watched her. Then she came out, kind of running, and in her hand was a photograph. She gave it to Joseph, and he looked at it. I could tell his hand was sort of trembling, but he never took his eyes off of it. And then she put her arm behind Joseph's back. He was still looking at the photograph, so he didn't flinch. And she walked him with her to her car. The big policeman watched, and she turned around and nodded to them. They let her go. And she brought Joseph to the back door of the car, opened it, and said, "Get in." He looked up at her. He looked behind him at the two policemen. "Oh, Joseph, it's the best we can do for now. Please." I looked at the two policemen. They were still watching. "Joseph," I said. He looked at me. "What are you doing here?" he said. "Looking for you," I said. He smiled. Really? He smiled. Number 8. Definitely, not sort of. He got into the car and leaned forward. "Look at this," he said, and showed me Jupiter. The librarian drove us back to Main Street, where my parents were standing and looking around, waiting. When we got out and my mother saw Joseph, she ran toward him. He probably wasn't sure if she was going to hug him or slaughter him. Probably she wasn't sure either. She ended up hugging him, and my father did too. Even Jupiter's foster mom hugged Joseph. "You look so much alike and determined like she is." Joseph just listened. It was like he was dragging every word about Jupiter into himself so that he could remember it and treasure it in his heart. "We're taking good care of her," she said. "I'm her father," said Joseph. She looked at him. "I'll tell her all about you. I'll write to you, I promise." And Joseph said, "Tell her His mouth, he stopped. His mouth sort of crumpled. "I will," she said. That was pretty much all Joseph said on the way home. We stopped at a diner so he could eat something, since he hadn't eaten for almost 2 days except for the Baptist potato chips and breakfast with Pastor Greenleaf. I won't even tell you how much he ate, except that my father had to look twice in his wallet to make sure he had enough money. We got home in time for milking. Rosie did her happy moo when she saw Joseph. Then at supper, he ate like we hadn't even stopped at the diner. That night, Joseph stood by the window in the cold dark. He held Jupiter's picture, looked at it, and then looked up at the sky, looked back at the picture. I was almost asleep when he said, "So, Jackie, you still have my back." "Yep, and it's Jack." "Yeah," he said, looking at the picture of Jupiter. "Thanks," he said. I don't know if he ever went to bed that night.